very warm welcome on behalf of Ananta, Aspen Center and IAM Kolkata chapter, the alumni chapter. A very warm welcome to all of you. Professor Subramania, Professor Khanna, Mr. Bagchi, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to hand over to Mr. GM this evening, very promptly on time. Mr. Kapoor.
Thank you, Ritushree. I'm speaking on behalf of the IIM Calcutta Alumni Association. A very warm welcome to all of you. The IIM Calcutta Alumni Association is a very active association all over the country, and our Calcutta chapter is more than active. We have our annual event called the Guru Speak, and which is on the 1st of February. We had the pleasure of Mr. Subramania, Professor Subramaniam with us, so I took the opportunity of organizing another Guru Speak with another renowned Guru, and I'll take this opportunity to introduce our learned speakers and then hand over to them. Professor V.S. Subramaniam is Professor of Computer Sciences at the University of Maryland and heads the Center for Digital International Government, having previously served as Director of the University of Maryland's Institute for Advanced Computer Studies. Professor Subramaniam is a well-renowned expert on big data analytics. His work has been used extensively by both industry and government to shape opinion in social media, influence terrorist group behaviors, and analyze educational outcomes. His OASYS systems, which works on 8 languages, and won the 2007 Computer-Terrorism Award, has been used by several organizations, including the World Bank, DARPA, Forbes, US Army, and others for real-time social media opinion analysis. He is the principal inventor of the CARA Cultural Reasoning Architecture and the SOMA Stochastic Logical Model for building models of group behaviors. He has applied this to modeling over 45 groups worldwide. His SCARE system, SCARE system for identifying locations of IED weapon caches in Baghdad and in the provinces of Helmand and Kandahar in Afghanistan, was the first system to accurately and efficiently identify locations of weapons caches. He has co-authored computational analysis of terrorist groups, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Springer, the first book to do a 360-degree analysis of a terrorist group using computational methods. Professor Subramaniam will give you more details of his the subject, and Professor Sushil Khanna will be moderating this session. Professor Sushil Khanna is Professor of Strategic Management Economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and on an aside, he is my class fellow as well at the IIM. So I can talk to you about him otherwise, but anyway, I'll read out the formal. Sushil Khanna is a Professor of Economics and Strategic Management at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. He was also visiting Professor, Helsinki School of Economics and Business Administration, Finland, and visiting Assistant Professor at the Department of Applied Economics, Catholic University Leuven, where he has expertise in merchant banking, microeconomic theory, comparative economic development, strategic management, international management uniform, police, and in intelligence. Served the Intelligence Bureau for 29 years in various capacities, specializing in counter-insurgency, counterintelligence, immigration, airport security, and industrial security. He was awarded the Indian Police Medal and President's Police Medal. Served for 4 years in Indian High Commission in London, and being in charge of Consular and Community Affairs. After retirement in 2011, he is working as CEO of a security solutions company. We also have with us the co-author of his book, You can please recognize Mr. Aaron Manis, who is the co-author, and he will also participate in the interaction. I will now hand the chair to Professor Sushil Khanna to start the program.
Welcome to all of you, and we are ready to kick off. Before we start, I have a request, which is a necessary request in India. Please switch off your mobile phones, and if it's on silent mode, please don't accept a call while the session is on. Let me begin. We are here to discuss application of computer science or modeling to understand terrorism, and the main speaker today is Professor Subramaniam. So I will request him to take half an hour or a little more, 40 minutes. 30 minutes will be fine, and after that we will take the session forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khanna, Mr. Gupta, Mr. Bagchi. It's a great honor to be here in Calcutta, speaking about the Indian Mujahideen. And I'd like to start by a large crowd and such a large core of military and security officers here, many of whom probably know a lot more about the Indian Mujahideen than I do. So please keep that in mind as we move forward. This is joint work with Aaron Manis, who's already been introduced, as well as two colleagues in India, Animesh Rao in Delhi and Dr. R.K. Raghavan, who used to be director of the CBI in Delhi, who's based in Chennai right now. So this has had a lot of input from people with very, very different backgrounds and many contributions, and I don't want to take credit for all of it, so I'm just the spokesman. This is our book, which has just been released in India, and I'm not selling it, but there is some information on it. It's a more affordable price than the Springer International edition. I'm going to move away from terrorism for a minute and speak about things that all of you might be familiar with. Everybody who's ordered anything online from an Amazon.com or an eBay or Flipkart in India knows that the way these organizations make money is by modeling the behavior of every single customer who ever comes to their website. And at a very high level, the way this works is as follows. And I'm going to tie this back to terrorism in the next slide. The way it works is a user comes in and poses a query. When the query is posed, the system looks at everything that that user and similar users have done in the past and the history of activities that preceded the query. What did the person look at in the past? What kinds of things did he or she click on but not buy? What kinds of things did he click on and buy? How long did he spend looking at a certain object or artifact that was displayed to him? On the basis of this past behavior and the context of the query, they learn, and the past actions of the user, they learn a behavioral model. When a new query comes in, they look at this behavior model and say, what does this behavior model forecast? So as an example, if you asked a query about a book, and Amazon forecast that you would be interested in this book, and this book, they want to then take those forecasts and figure out which of those books or other related products to actually show you on the page. That is to learn a model of your behavior and then continuously use that to make forecasts into what you might or might not like in the future, and then use that to shape what they're going to show you and what they're not. Okay, I've taken exactly the same picture and filled the boxes in with slightly different terms to model the behavior of a terrorist group. We all know that over time, these groups have done various things. They've taken various kinds of actions, mostly bad, and they've done this in various contexts. This is much like the history of past interactions that occurred on an Amazon website. So instead of looking at what the person did, what was shown to him in the past, etc., what choices he had, what this says is, what was the context in which, what was going on so at or around the time or preceding the events or the actions that the group took. And on the basis of this, you look at what socio-political economic context there was, you look at what actions the group IM in this case took, and you build a behavioral model for them. And then at any given point in time, such as today, you look and say, what's the environment looking like today? What can I forecast might happen? And then what kinds of actions, based on the model, can we try and recommend that might help reduce acts of terror by groups like this? There's no guarantee. I should start by saying forecasts can and often are wrong. Policies can and often don't work. And that's the same for Amazon as well. Okay? So the fact that things may or may not work is a function of the fact that adversaries are changing all the time. People's behavioral models don't capture exact reality. So about 7 or 8 years back, we introduced a platform called SOMA, Stochastic Opponent Modeling Agents. And I'm going to ask our friends here if they can play this little video clip by clicking on the screen. And that will explain the idea behind behavioral modeling much more effectively than I think I can. Hollywood does a pretty good job at it.
I was wondering why a biotech company would be interested in kidnapping.
You think there's an underlying motive?
Big corporation, government contracts, pulling DC. You know, we could put together a stochastic opponent modeling agent. You could?
Someone was designed by the Department of Defense to understand the motivations and assign probabilities to the actions of terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas.
It's a lot like coaches studying game tape. Take soccer, for instance. A corner kick gives the attacking team a hefty advantage. They decide the initial variables of the play. When to kick it, where to kick it, how to curve the ball. Now it's up to the opposing team's coaches to know these variables, to use them to predict the play for their defense. Will they bend the kick into the net or punch it out to a rushing attacker for a head-on try? The team that studies their opponent will be more likely to stop the goal. That explains why every soccer match I ever watched ended 0-0.
All right. So I think in the city of Mohan Bagan, that perhaps is more appropriate than say in Delhi or Mumbai. A brief history of IM. Many of you already know this, but IM, unlike Lashkar-e-Taiba and many other groups, is a much more diffuse, somewhat more decentralized entity than, for example, Lashkar. And it is so murky in its origins that it's even quite hard to pin down exactly when it was actually founded. Elements of IM go back to the attacks on the American Center in 2002, January, which was carried out by the Asif Riza Commando Force. And Amir Riza Khan was later one of the founders of IM, or at least several people, including us, believe that that was the case. And you can see from this chart that the number of attacks carried out by IM peaked in 2008, even though the largest number of fatalities in any given calendar year was in 2006, when the Mumbai train bombings killed approximately 200 people. So, even though early on, the fact that there was this new organization called IM was not entirely clear, it took a few years afterwards to recognize that they existed. And as you can see, in the 2008 terror campaign, there were a very large number of bombs. And the sort of signature of IM is these multiple timed attacks, where multiple targets are attacked in a very, very short period of time, usually on the order of about 20-30 minutes. You have several bombs going off in places, typically in one city, but there have also been cases in UP, for example, where courthouses in multiple cities were bombed at about the same time. Many of these were accompanied by manifestos or claims of responsibility mailed either just before the attacks, you're talking about 5-10 minutes before the attacks, or while the attacks were in progress, making these claims somewhat credible. This past year, 2013, saw a significant increase in attacks by IM compared to the previous couple of years. We had bombings in Hyderabad, we had bombings most recently in Patna, and there was the Bodh Gaya bombings as well. And so we're seeing an increase in the number of IM attacks. I do want to note one thing. One of IM's operational chiefs, Yasin Batkal, was arrested towards the late part of August this past year. And these attacks continued despite that arrest, the Patna bombings. IM tactics, before I get to the model, this is just a brief history, have involved both bombs made from very simple and easy to acquire materials, like ammonium nitrate, but have also included more sophisticated elements, such as hacking computer accounts, using them to send emails claiming responsibility, and so forth. Though IM is, I think most of my authors, the co-authors, would agree if I were to say that the lethality of IM has been significantly multiplied by support received from Pakistan, and the ISI in particular, in some cases through Lashkar-e-Taiba. In addition, several individuals arrested in connection with IM attacks have been trained in Pakistan or in related countries, have used travel documents, Pakistani travel documents, to go to places such as Pakistan or the Middle East from neighboring countries in the region. So without Pakistani support, we doubt very much if IM would be the organization it is today. A somewhat lethal and deadly organization. With that, I come to the study that we actually conducted. I'm a data person, and what this means is when we do a study, whether it's on education or on terrorism, we collect a lot of data and organize it to look like a database. For our study on LET, which was published in September 2012, and our study on IM, we identified a total of about 770 variables. These variables fell into two categories. Variables describing the actions taken by the group, such as bombings, multiple timed attacks, bombings on security installations, attacks on professional security forces, and so forth. Those were the actions of the groups that we wanted to be able to predict and model. And what we call environmental variables that describe many other variables. What was the social or prevailing context in the country when these attacks took place, or in a given month? What were the actions by other actors? So in other words, if we have several representatives of the police from Kolkata and India here, what were police actions during those times? Diplomatic relations. Was there a warming of diplomatic relations between India and Pakistan? And so forth. So these environmental variables correspond to that box that I call context on the slides that I showed you with respect to Amazon and IM. What we try to do from this body of data is to identify what we call temporal probabilistic rules. Rules that predict that when these conditions are true in the environment, that IM will carry out this kind of attack 1, 2, 3 months later with some probability. Even though we derived a lot of rules, we trimmed them down to just a handful, which we thought were the best and most explanatory rules. And I'm going to talk about those in the next few slides. But I'm going to take a little drink of water before I do that. So, the first observation we noted was that there was a relationship between, a predictive relationship between arrests of IM personnel and subsequent attacks. By the way, when I talk about these rules, I do want to say that we're not saying that IM is consciously operating under the rules that I'm showing. It says that these rules are true of what's happening that we see, whether they know it or not. And, but let me also say a couple of other things before I go on to the rules actually. The first, I should say, is all our data is open source data. So my lab works solely in open source information. We gather information from published sources. We develop algorithms to mine that data. And then we put out the results of our findings. Everything is open source. That has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, I can come and talk to you here about it. The disadvantage is perhaps I don't have all the data. And in the case of IM, compared to our previous study of LET, we have way less data for many reasons, which I'll go into as we get along. And part of the reason I'm saying this is, as a scientist, it's sort of mandatory for me to tell you what the shortcomings of our study are. So when I get to the end of my slide, I'll try and recap those. So IM attacks public sites, typically markets, a short while after the government has arrested a certain number of IM operatives. Now, we're not asserting that the arrests are the cause of subsequent attacks. We're just saying that arrests seem to be followed by attacks afterwards. And in fact, there may be some explicit causation as well, because we have seen statements put out by IM saying that even though these people were arrested, they were going to go ahead and carry out attacks to show how strong they are. So part of the reason why attacks might be occurring could be after an arrest, could be a desire on the part of IM to show that they are strong, but it could be just a sign that something is in the works, and perhaps that's why the arrest occurred in the first place, because an operation was being planned, it was flagged by security forces, and led to the arrest rather than the other way around. So we're not asserting this is causation, but rather that arrests seem to signal subsequent action coming down the pipe. By the way, I do want to say one more thing. We generally liked, in the case of our study on Lashkar, all the rules we derived had a much higher support than in the case of the rules we derived for IM. Reasons for this, really, I think, were because of the fact that Lashkar has been around for about 3 times as long as IM. Therefore, there's a much longer history of acts that they've carried out, allowing us to derive more robust rules. In the case of IM, we had to do the best we can, which meant usually accepting rules with a lower degree of support than we'd have liked. So, I didn't want to throw that in for anybody who's a statistician in this audience. So, not the ideal situation, but the best we were able to do. Okay, India-Pakistan relations. What we noticed was that a few months, about 5 months, by the way, all these times also should be taken with a grain of salt. 5 months means, about 5 months, but could be 4, could be 6. But approximately 5 months after months in which India-Pakistan ties started warming up, the IM carried out attacks. Again, we don't know if this was, I don't have the data, but perhaps some of the gentlemen in the audience have information that suggests other things to them. But it's possible that elements within Pakistan who are threatened by diplomacy having a chance of success attempt to destroy the chances of better relations between India and Pakistan. I do want to point out also that our definition of diplomacy in Pakistan-India relations includes meetings which have a fairly congenial tone between prime ministers of the 2 countries, such as the meeting between Nawaz Sharif and Mr. Manmohan Singh in September. So again, you see this here, and The way you can think of this picture here is to look at the blue peaks and see that red peaks are following them shortly thereafter. It's not a great picture because in some places the blue and the red lines are actually superimposed on each other. But that's what's going on. Here's another funny thing. When IM claims responsibility for past attacks, you can actually expect more attacks down the road. We're not sure why again. But this suggests that perhaps IM is using their claims of responsibility in past attacks to energize their supporters and their operatives in a sense, saying, hey, all these attacks succeeded in the past, and be strong and carry out these attacks. Perhaps that's what is intended. That's speculation, I should say. But we do know this. So we do know that a couple of months after claims of responsibility are issued, attacks seem to occur. This should be no surprise to anyone in the audience, so it's also nice sometimes to just find that things everybody expects fall out of the data mining engine. And this tells us that shortly after there's any kind of religious violence in India, you can expect attacks a couple of months later, 1 or 2 months later. And conferences. Over the years, IM has organized conferences where some of their leadership meet, typically in jungles in Karnataka, Kerala, and so forth. And about 4 months after months in which these conferences occur, we've noticed that again, they carry out different types of attacks with high probability, but again, low support goes. So, I've given you about 5 variables relating to IM's environment that, when those variables are true, seem to be followed a few months later by attacks of one sort or another. Before I go any further, let me say a little bit more about these rules. The rules we derive are defined in a way that satisfy 3 properties. One, when the precondition of the rule is true, in this case, the existence of a month in which IM organized a conference, I want the probability that the attacks occur 1 or 2 months later to be high. Because that tells me that this rule does in fact identify a condition which, when turned on, predicts an attack with high probability. That's not enough. And the reason is, I also want to be sure that when the attacks occur, this condition occurred 1 or 2 months earlier. So in other words, the occurrence of the attack in this month and the occurrence of the precondition 1, 2, or a few months earlier, both are occurring simultaneously with just the time shift. So in other words, they're sort of pegged together as a pair. The third condition we want is that in months when IM did not organize a conference, that is, when the condition organized a conference is not turned on, then the likelihood of an attack by IM a couple of months later is low. Okay? So those are the 3 criteria we're looking for. When the condition is turned on, attack occurs with high probability. When the condition is turned off, attack occurs with low probability. The greater the difference between those 2 probabilities, the more likely it is that the condition is distinguishing between cases which seem to indicate an attack and cases which seem to not indicate an attack. So this is sort of think of these conditions as the proverbial canary in the coal mine. In the old days, miners would go into coal mines which contain various kinds of lethal gases, and rather than die by accidentally inhaling these gases, they would send a bird in there and see what happened to the bird. It's a sort of unfortunate situation for the bird, but it saved a lot of human lives. And these conditions are like that bird. When the condition is lit, it's turned on, attacks occur with high probability. When it's turned off, they occur with low probability. So the conditions distinguish between the 2 cases. Those are the types of conditions we're looking for. If I can summarize the things I just said, here's what we learn about IM. Diplomatic relations between India show some signs, even a faint, of taking a turn for the better in a given month. And shortly after that, IM organizes a conference. I don't know the details of what goes on in these conferences, but we have several cases where those conferences did take place. Perhaps they were to discuss what to do about these warming of ties and how to execute attacks. But that's speculation. After that, in the next couple of months, several things happen, including one condition I've not talked about so far, which I'll briefly mention. So, not all these things happen, but some subset, non-trivial subset of these things happen. There's some religious violence in India. There are arrests of IM operatives. There are claims of responsibility for past attacks. IM ramps up putting out publicity materials, and I'll give you an example of these later. And we see greater mobility between members of IM and other non-state actors, armed groups, like HUJI, HUM, and so forth. So, what all these things suggest is that there's some pattern here. Diplomatic ties, conference, and a short while later, some subset of these things showing up. All of which, when they occur in these kinds of sequences, strengthen our belief that something bad is in the works. Again, we could be wrong, and sometimes we are. I didn't want to say that. One thing I didn't want to mention is that these conditions that we've identified, of which I've just shown a handful, allow us also to think about how to generate policies against IM. And the way they do that is the following. Remember I said that when this condition is true, in this example, IM organized a conference, you expect attacks a few months later. Did not organize a conference, you do not expect attacks a few months later. What this tells you is that you can think of these variables in the if part of these rules. You know, if IM organizes a conference, a few months later this happens. You can think of these variables as policy levers that you can try and turn on or off through appropriate policing or other action. So for example, I could look at these and say, well, if I want to, because why? I know that when this precondition does not occur, the probability of this kind of attack at least is low, right? So if I can somehow try to prevent this precondition from occurring, I'm hoping that I'm disrupting whatever attacks are going on. So what we tried to do was to say, well, can we look at these rules and figure out what subsets of these preconditions we can turn off to see if we can prevent any of these rules from having preconditions that would cause the rule to be triggered, causing a high probability of the event occurring. Because we know that if these preconditions are turned off, the probability of these events occurring is low. All right, so that's my mathematical piece for the day, and I promise not to, inject any more. But here's what we saw. The environmental conditions preceding attacks are these. We've already talked about them. NSAG here is a non-state armed group. And here are some of the potential policies. So clearly, I don't think anybody, rational anyway, wants to see India-Pakistan relations take a turn for the worse. Everybody would like to live in a reasonable sense of peace, security, and tranquility. So we don't really want to disrupt this, but what we do know, what we do observe, is that there are certain elements who would like to trigger attacks when a diplomatic warming occurs. Best we can do in this case is to increase security operations in the wake of activity which signals positive diplomacy. Mr. Bagchi, during a brief discussion I had with him before this talk, addressed a point which is closely related to the second. Internal conflict, religious conflict in India. Clearly, we know that that's a trigger for attacks. We want to be able to diffuse it. There are many, many ways of diffusing it. We've not done a comprehensive study of it, but some of it is to monitor these religious violent events more closely and develop very, very careful plans to mitigate the risk of those attacks getting blown into something, very bad. I mean, contain it as much as possible. But at the same time, perhaps also religious minorities need to be, there should be an element of human development which enables them to be more successful economically and otherwise, making it possible to lessen the likelihood of these kinds of events occurring. Arrests. Okay, so arrest is a very important thing. We don't expect security forces to not arrest people who are in the middle of attacking carrying out an attack or planning for an attack. But perhaps the publicity surrounding these arrests should be more nuanced. Perhaps rather than publicize it widely, it could be used as an opportunity to sow confusion amongst the group itself. One of the points we noticed in our earlier study of Lashkar-e-Taiba was that in the few cases when LET experienced internal dissension and elements of splitting within the organization, there were no attacks whatsoever. Okay? Absolutely none. That suggested that anything that might help internal dissent, anything that might increase internal dissent within the organization was likely to have at least the positive benefit of reducing attacks. I mean, simply put, if they're fighting with each other, they are less likely to attack innocent people. So this would be an opportunity to use the arrests to plant appropriately nuanced intelligence and misinformation to help muddy the waters and leave IAMs scratching their heads trying to figure out what's going on. Did the guy get arrested, or did he bolt off with a chunk of money? Communications. As I mentioned earlier, IAM puts out frequent communications, and I'll talk about that later. So we want to be able to monitor their communications in real time to the extent possible. Develop tools to determine the veracity of the claims after a claim of responsibility is put out. Conferences. These conferences, at least the existence or the fact that these conferences are happening, needs to be monitored closely. I'm sure that agencies in this business know far better ways than I do to do that. And also, all these terrorist groups are interlinked. We have a study that's ongoing right now where we're looking at the relationships between multiple groups from East Asia all the way up to basically the western end of Asia. So there are many, many connections between not just the groups, but also various criminal networks. So we want to be able to monitor this because not only are personnel going back and forth, in many cases, intelligence and operational experiences, logistical facilities are being outsourced from one organization to another. So we know various Al-Qaeda operatives were found in LET safe houses, for instance, showing the existence of these links. Let me say a little bit about disrupting IAM's relations with other terrorist groups. We've noticed in our data set that several IAM operatives traveled out of India on legitimate Indian passports to a neighboring country and then used Pakistani passports to move forward from there to other countries, Pakistan and certain countries in the Middle East. Hard to monitor that if there aren't friendly relationships or capabilities to assess outbound travel from countries in the neighborhood. I don't know what the capabilities are, but those need to be there. Otherwise, you don't know who's going where. Disrupting conferences. Again, I talked about spreading dissension, but there are many ways to spread dissension amongst the group. That needs to be done. Cyber operations is one way. Okay, this is such a controversial topic, but I must say it, so I will. After the 9/11 attacks in the US, and amidst let me say this carefully, reports of intelligence failures, a National Counter-Terrorism Center was created. We don't want things to slip between the cracks. Organizations have their own culture and their own way of doing things. And a piece of information here and a piece of information here, both of which look innocuous on their own, might convey a whole different meaning when combined together. That's why there's a need for a center of this sort. Okay, and I'll stop with bad news. And I hope I'm wrong. So I usually put out at least one prediction when I give a public talk. Not every time, but often enough. Last year in January, when I spoke at an Aspen event in Delhi about my LET book, I predicted the opposite. And I said I don't expect any attacks in the first quarter of 2013 from LET. This year, conditions are slightly different. And I'm talking about IM this time. We think, I wish I could give you more specific information, but I can't. So we predict, based on our models, that IM will carry out some attacks in the next few months, between now, next 4 months. Why? Let us ignore this third thing here, okay? The models themselves say that arrests are usually followed by attacks a few months later. And we do know that a bunch of IM operatives were arrested shortly after the Patna attacks in the first half of November. A bunch of SIMI and IM operatives were also arrested in December. This is not part of our model, but we take it as contextual information that perhaps supports the conclusion we're drawing, which is that there were also claims made by some of the arrestees of IM's interests in disrupting the electoral process. I talked earlier briefly about rules about IM putting out publicity to get their message out. We know that in November and December, IM used video clips and imagery from the Babri Masjid incident, as well as the Gujarat attacks, to try and stir up trouble and radicalize youth in Jharkhand. So, and last but not least, the very slight warming of Indo-Pakistan ties in September, I'm sorry, this should be 2013, of course, is also an indicator to us that, you know, the conditions are right. So I hope I'm wrong on this, and I'll give you some reasons why I hope why I could be wrong. First, and these are the shortcomings of our study. First, our data is open source data. That means that we do not have, in my lab, the best data that's available to some of the gentlemen and ladies in this room. We don't have that. Maybe our models will change. We've done some robustness testing with our models, and but you know, the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. I don't think our data is garbage, but I do know it's incomplete. And so new data could change our conclusions. I want to be very upfront about that. Second, it's possible, of course, all groups change their behavior periodically. Our model is based on learning these rules from past behavior of the group. We don't think that's something that's going to change at a very rapid pace, but it could. And so that's another reason why we might be wrong. Third, you know, Aaron and I, including Aaron in this to share the blame, are human. And so we could both be wrong just because we did something wrong as well. So all those things are possible. So there are a number of shortcomings with the study. The other shortcoming, which I think friends here from the police could argue, and they would be right, is to say, well, look, you know, telling us more attacks are coming is great, but we need to know where and when. And you're telling us, you know, 4 or 5 month time frame somewhere, okay? I would love to be more precise, but you will notice that the support I had for the rules I was able to derive were 4. If I now restrict it to not just attacks, but attacks in UP, or attacks in Delhi, that support is going to plummet to 1 or 2, at which point it becomes a one-off case, and we really don't know if that rule's any good or not. So I don't have the ability to predict that, and without more data, I doubt if anybody using our data could make a much more nuanced presentation. So much as I'd like to, I don't know how to do that. So I'd like to conclude with one note of, actually 2 notes of thanks. One is, I want to recognize the fabulous work by Shishir Gupta of the Hindustan Times, who wrote a book that was a great source for us on the Indian Mujahideen. It's the first book that I've seen on this group. And, you know, we are not, my lab doesn't look at gathering primary data. We don't go like journalists and talk to people and figure out who was arrested, when they were arrested, what they said, etc., etc. We rely on others to do that and build on their material. So Shishir's book was a great source of inspiration to us, as was Wilson John's book on Lashkar-e-Taiba, which also gave us a tremendous amount of information about IM versus Pakistani links. We also, of course, use many other sources, including work by Praveen Swamy, Stephen Tankel, and others. So with that, I think I'll stop. Oh, sorry. I don't think you need to know that I have backup slides, but thank you very much. So.
Thank you. We will have a time for questions from the floor and discussion and comments right at the end. But in case any of you have any clarificated question on the slides, or if you could not understand some of those things, we could allow one or two clarificated questions. Do you have something? Yeah.
So I'd just like to point out that coincidentally India is going to have its parliamentary election in May this year. That might cause some type of trouble with this. So did you thought of that? Did you remove that aspect from your predictions?
Okay, I was wondering how I could avoid answering
I
that.
think avoid this question now.
But-
We'll take it right at the end.
No,
What
I-
is clarificated question?
Yeah. I can take a stab at answering it.
Okay, go ahead. Finish.
Very quickly, you know, our data models, we did include information, historical data about elections, but we had no data, no rules of any significance that we could derive showing a relationship between past elections and attacks aimed at disrupting those elections. As a consequence, the circumstances today are different from circumstances that have been encountered in the past. So yes, as I showed, oops, I think I lost my slides. But as I mentioned in the last slide where I was making a prediction for the next 3-4 months, I did include one small snippet of information saying that certain arrested IM operatives have explicitly made a note of IM's interest in disrupting the elections. That is, I would say, from our perspective, not a fact, not a validation that comes out of our theoretical model or our data, but is something that adds support to what our rules said anyway, which is that attacks were probably coming in the next few months, which of course happens to coincide with the election.
I have a question, Professor. Let's say you've been talking to people as Professor on the other side. Let's say this is an IM assembly and you are not Professor. Or, you know. Would you recommend random computer-generated dates to counter what you have said?
You mean to make my prediction false?
Yes. Supposing you were an IM operator and you were giving us a lecture on what you had said.
I must say that, well, first I have no experience of that. But I would say that if I am backed off making the attacks in order to prove my prediction wrong, I would be very pleased.
What would be advice to IM operators sitting in front of you?
Yeah, so I think there's something we've been thinking about, which is the ability of a group to look at the rules that we disclose and then reshape their behavior on the basis of that. Okay? So they could look and say, well, V.S. Subramanian says he's learned X, Y, and Z rules, and there are 100 people in Kolkata sitting and listening to him, so maybe we should take this seriously, so we're going to change our operating mode. We thought about this, and this is a paper that's going to come out. It's a much more technical paper than this. But what we show is that actually disclosing nothing and disclosing everything is probably not the right thing to do. And the reason is that disclosing some rules that you've got strategically actually has the ability to constrain the adversary, making his actions more predictable and hence more defensible. Let me take a very simple example to make this point. Slightly outside terrorism, but let's say I'm in West Bengal, tigers are being poached at a record, in large numbers anyway, much larger than anybody would like. And I've got a game park. If I credibly disclose, if I'm in charge of protecting the tigers, and I was to credibly disclose that I know poachers are going to attack this corner of the park. Let's say I use the stable of the park, and I tell them, this slice of the park, I know people are going to attack, and I put out a credible deterrent to attacks there by deploying some additional personnel. What this is going to do is to have the impact of moving the poachers elsewhere. If I now make my disclosure in a way that I move them to a territory that I can defend more easily, then I have an advantage which I did not have before. So some disclosure is valuable, but you've got to do that in a very strategic way and on the basis of a very careful analysis of what kind of disclosure, how it changes the space of options for the adversary, and how it changes your ability to defend what they might refocus their targeting efforts on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's something that is related to something we're thinking about.
I think we will stick to questions on the slides, clarificatory questions, no questions on substantive discussion on the arguments Professor Subramanian has given. Yes, sir.
My question is that there were 5 variables that you had mentioned. One was India-Pak ties and the targeting of public sites, when IM claims responsibility was the second, Hindu-Muslim violence was the third, and IM conferences being held was the fourth. I believe there was a fifth. What was that?
There was one on publicity surrounding IMs, such as the videos that were released a couple of months back on attempts to get a message out that would help energize their supporters and or radicalize others who might be so inclined. So there was one about IM's outreach and publicity and communications efforts, and so I think there was one more. There was the ties between IM and other non-state armed groups.
Yeah.
So there were actually, 2 that were missing in the list.
One question was, is Kashmir nowhere mentioned? Because typically in India, Indo-Pak ties, that is a typical conflagration point. So that was not something that we have mentioned during this discussion.
So that shows up a lot in our work on Lashkar-e-Taiba and less in our work on IM. So you're absolutely right that Kashmir is a big flashpoint. But it seems, and Aaron, maybe you want to jump in here, but we've not sort of separated out Kashmir from the rest of India in our analysis, but the rules that seem to pertain to Kashmir that we could find that were defendable were more related to LET than to Indian Mujahideen. But Aaron, perhaps you want to add something to that.
Right, I would just echo that. Certainly Kashmir has shown up at times in Indian Mujahideen's rhetoric. Oh wow, so now I don't have to yell. Awesome. So it's shown up in their rhetoric, but not in a consistent way that we could develop any valid rules. The correlation between warming Indian-Pakistani ties and Indian Mujahideen violence may be linked to events in Kashmir. It may not. We can't say for certain. We have to admit correlation is not causation. We can't say that for certain. We can only say that these things do seem to line up.
I just add something as a Kashmiri.
That's all. That's all. Please. We'll get chance later. Any more clarificatory questions? Let me ask as an example to Professor Subramaniam. What do you mean by inverse probability? I think you explained to me, I would like you to explain to the audience. Secondly, how do you measure things like warming up of ties between two countries? You know, you need an indicator, you will need something. How much is warming up? Is it hot or cold? And so on. So some of these things.
I do have my mic, but let me take the inverse probability question, and I'm going to hand the warming question to Aaron as he quoted the data. So the inverse probability, there are three probabilities we measure. Suppose I have a condition and an attack. I want to measure the what I call probability is the probability of the attack given that the condition is true. What I call inverse probability is the probability of the condition being true given that the attack has occurred, with, of course, the time frames adjusted suitably. And then there's what we call the negative probability that I didn't actually put up, which says the probability of the attack given that the condition is not true. Okay? So a rule is good if its probability and inverse probability are high and its negative probability is low. In terms of how the data was coded, Aaron, on Indo-Pak warming?
Sure. We looked for significant improvements in relations. New trade agreements being signed, substantive meetings between top officials, not the standard operating procedures, meetings that were sort of required by standard treaties, not those things, but major meetings between foreign ministers, between prime ministers, and also in some of the trade agreements that were signed when they were very close on breakthroughs in talks. So that's really what we coded as an improvement in relations.
Okay, thank you. I think we would like to hear Mr. Bakshi, his comments. He's a senior police officer, has been with the Terrorism Bureau for 30 years. So I think let him have his say, and then we will open the floor to discussion, unless there is a very pressing question from someone who insists that we take it up right now. Is there anything like that? Pardon?
And the thing is that my question is, in the context of Bengal, I'm putting forward my question. So what do you think is the reason for not having any attacks in Bengal, and more specifically in Calcutta? After 2000...
You're wrong, sir. The attack on the American...
That's what I'm saying. In 2000, after 2002 American-centered attacks, is it, what do you think, is it the environmental reason?
I will wait for that at the end. Please.
Okay.
Please. Yes.
No, it is fully within the context.
Professor Subramaniam, if you can answer the question. Would you please elaborate a little bit more on open source data and how you validate it?
Shall I take it? All right. So, sorry, I turned my mic off in the hopes that I was done answering questions. But that's a great question. So what we looked at is the following. We looked at, as I said, we defined 770 variables. We tried to code the data on a monthly basis. And we basically, what this meant is we had a protocol of what it meant to code that some event occurred during a month or not. What it meant, as Aaron described in the case of diplomatic warming, what that meant. And so we had some rules that we used for each of the 770 variables. The open sources itself we looked at included large numbers of reports and books put out by various people, large amounts of news sources. In particular, we were interested in news sources where multiple, at least seemingly independent sources reported similar information. I say seemingly independent because it's not always clear whether they all came out of one press conference or not. But we did try to check that. But I think scientific literature, reports, and books and articles in reasonably respected newspapers.
Secondary
Right,
data.
last technical, I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
Aaron, did you want to add something to that?
You covered it. We read everything we could, but we can't know it, we can't
It's
read
a kind
it.
of
So you manually-
It's the kind of information you can also get.
Secondary data.
You may refer.
All secondary.
He does not have the kind of information the police officers sitting here have in their files. That's what he meant.
Of course, no, I'm wondering whether it was manual sifting through data, or did you have a software that ran all the way across everywhere?
So the answer to both questions is yes, which sounds a little odd. So we do have software that tries to extract these 770 variables, but in this study we did not use it. That software is about 70 to 75% accurate. So there's still a fair amount of manual work that needs to go into cleaning it. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you.
But it becomes harder, I should say, with that software to figure out what's reliable, what's not, etc. So I still think a fair amount of manual work is needed. Semi-automated.
Thank you. Mr. Ravid Bakshi now, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. We just had a wonderful discussion by Professor about the new book which has come out. I had the good fortune to flip through the pages and read some of it. Cutting out the scientific part and the computer part, which I don't understand much, but being a police officer, there are certain aspects of the book which I thought appeal to us, and as police and intelligence officers, we may focus on them, which would help us in the years to come to handle this problem, which is acquiring very serious proportions in our country. One of the issues which appealed to me was the discussion on the timing of future or probable incidents. Now, this he could derive from the statistics that the team had gleaned through, and interestingly enough, they have suggested that in different situations, the events can be predicted with reasonable certainty. There may be certain changes in the time frame, but basically, like they said about arrests of important IM operatives or conferences being held, secret conferences being held by the IM, or claiming responsibility of particular incidents or particular developments, or diplomatic developments, particularly relating to India and Pakistan. Now, for us, the important thing is that it gives us a parameter by which we can plan our operations or decisions or actions to be taken to handle this. I mean, it cannot be the only parameter, but yes, it does give us a very important hint. While going through the book, I could make out that yes, because since in IB we were dealing with IM very closely and in a focused manner, we found that there are certain arguments which indicate that when a particular incident can be expected. This is all based on past incidents, but there is an indication. Then another issue which appealed to me was follow-up actions, particularly after arrest. This is one area where I feel most of us in the police, what happens is when you arrest an important man, yes, you interrogate him. And there's a lot of activity, flurry of activity for several days. There's a successful encounter, again, for a short while. And then gradually it tapers off. There is no long-term follow-up action in most cases. There are exceptions, but in most cases. As a result, you have repetitive incidents in different parts of the country, and we take an inordinately long time to learn as to how the IM will operate in future. Thirdly, Professor and his team had dealt or discussed about the weaponry of IM. though operating in a pan-India basis and in the 21st century, the weaponry used by them is rather crude and off-date. They depend mostly on IEDs, and IEDs not very sophisticated. That may be one of the reasons why they choose crowded areas to operate. But the weaponry used by them is rather crude. Firearms are rarely used by them. Then this may be because of cost factor. This may be because that they can easily disguise themselves. Or this may be also because easy availability of material for preparing the IEDs. Then another issue which I thought was rather interesting in the book was that the decision to set up a NCTC, the National Counter-Terrorism Center. Now this has been a very ticklish issue, and while I was in IB, I had an opportunity to look at it from close quarters, and everybody was trying to protect his own turf, the government of India, the state governments, the EIB and others, and everybody wanted to have a say about the NCTC and how it would operate. Be that as it may, but as an intelligence officer, I feel there is a need to have an organization or a center of this type which will collect, disseminate all the information and take action at a rapid and focused manner. This has been tried out in the US with great deal of success, but unfortunately we have not been able to make much headway. My appeal to our people in the intelligence community as well as informed citizens is that we should go for such a center where we should have people from various disciplines, have a proper analysis made so that nothing is lost in between. Other issues like politics, like self-interest, like other things, regional interest, that can take a back seat, but we need to do this. And lastly, one issue which the professor just mentioned in passing, I had a discussion with him before this interaction, was that terrorism in India by IM, like insurgency movements, is not only alone our problem. There are various other issues involved which needs to be addressed in a focused manner so that we do not allow an ambience or a situation to develop where the IM can function. There should not be groups of people or areas which are vulnerable where the IM finds a fertile ground to operate. This requires a more comprehensive approach to the problem than merely a police or law and order issue. That's all.
Yeah, well done.
The floor is open for questions. We will take 3 questions at a time. Sir, you are the first. You have waited long.
We will take 3 at a time because otherwise it gets lost.
So you need a microphone, he's bringing a microphone for you.
First, sir, I congratulate you on taking up this subject which is of great national importance. May I be permitted to add 1 or 2 more dimensions to the discussion? We call them terrorists. Actually, on the other side of the table, when we talk to them, they say it is our duty. They never call themselves a terrorist. This is a foreign word to them. You understand what I am trying to tell you. You see, it's a history of more precisely 765 years. 765 years. 500 of Islamic rules in India. 200 years of British rule when they were given more importance. And 65 years of Indian independence. We have not been able to solve this problem in 765 years. And if we continue to try to solve this problem in this manner, it may take 1,000 years, but we will be all sitting here and only discussing. One important point we have completely missed about this problem is illegal immigrants in India. They are 1 crore, 2 crore, or 3 crore. They become a very big weapon to carry out all these things. You were saying about financially helping them. I'm sorry. They ruled this country for 500 years. The finances were in their hand. In 65 years of Indian independence, they get much more benefits. The benefits which are not given to majority or any other minority in India. But still the problem is continuing. So sir, my question is that you have to evolve to basics, and also add to your dimensions. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Please introduce yourself, your name, and then ask your question.
Hello, I am Snigdhendu Bhattacharya from Hindustan Times. Actually, you were telling about one specific thing, that the police, when they arrest IM operatives, generally they publicize it, widely publicize it, that yes, see, we have got a big catch here. You were telling that instead of widely publicizing it, the police or the intelligence operatives should use it in a nuanced manner to spread misinformation and spread confusion in the ranks and files of the organization. So would you please elaborate how it could be done?
Thank you. Thank you. We'll come back to this. Another question? Anybody? Yeah. Yes, sir. Microphone is here? Shall I go ahead? No, sir. There. At the back.
You know, there's this famous Sherlockism about the dog that did nothing in the night time. 2009 is a year with no action. How does that zero action year figure in your model?
Really deadly attacks have taken place in the US, although they have tried very, very hard, the Al-Qaeda as well as other terrorist groups. Second point I'd like to say is, it is said that Mossad has completely infiltrated Hamas, with the result that if a single terrorist attack takes place in Israel, it is very, very unlikely that that man will escape alive. Could you please contrast that with the situation in India, when every few months terrorist attacks keep taking place, and everyone escapes?
We are a soft state.
Since you are such a learned man on the subject,
we are a soft
I'd like
people
your
and soft
opinion
state.
on that.
That's all.
No, we'll answer the 3 questions, then we'll take more questions. Yes, sir.
Let me start with the last question first, which I think I can unfortunately answer rather easily with an I don't know the answer to the question. And the reason is, we've not really studied the Mossad strategies against Hamas in detail, and so I would prefer not to offer an uninformed opinion. With respect to the question raised by the
US strategy, you can comment on US strategy.
Yes. Again, I do want to say that I have not studied it and collected data on it to the depth we've collected data on IM or on LT. But the Department of Homeland Security in the US has done a pretty good job, I think, in making sure that attacks do not happen on the US mainland. That said, there have been attacks on US personnel outside the borders of the United States. Attacks on personnel in certain countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, have been carried out by insurgent groups linked to Al-Qaeda, telling us that the structural conditions that one hoped would go away have not, in fact, gone away. But the US has done an outstanding job and Department of Homeland Security has done an outstanding job in keeping terrorism out of the borders of the US. So I think I can say that. Going to the question asked at the beginning, first, our study did not go back 765 years. And, you know, I think, as Mr. Bagchi here said, and I want to qualify this as an opinion rather than a technical statement we've derived. I want to draw a distinction between what's supported in a fairly comprehensive way by data and opinion. I usually don't hazard opinions, but I think I'm going to stick my neck out and do so. Generally speaking, you know, I want to go back to, as I was coming to the Bengal Club today, we drove past on a street called Shakespeare Sarani, and I'm reminded of Julius Caesar saying, "Let me have men about me that are fat." And really what this meant was, let me have people who are satisfied with their lot in life, not necessarily be physically fat. And so I think it is always in the interests of a country to make sure that its citizens have the human development opportunities that they deserve, irrespective of religious or ethnic background. So from this perspective, I would like to support Mr. Bagchi's comments that, you know, rather than have, you know, a divisive strategy, it's good to try and help develop the population as a whole, not in a discriminatory way, but in a way that applies to everybody. So I don't see how that can be a wrong thing to do, though of course you might disagree.
Illegal immigrants.
Oh, yes.
Illegal immigrants. None of them are involved in IM attacks. The evidence shows that.
Again, I mean, illegal immigrants we did not study, and you know, so I won't comment.
The rest of the
Yeah. So again, I wanted to clarify that I didn't say the police, you know, engage in a lot of publicity when they make high-value arrests or arrests of high-value personnel. What I did say is it's preferable to avoid doing that, should it happen. You asked for tactics, and I'm sorry to say I'm not an expert on tactics, but Aaron, looks like you want to say something, so please.
So on that, we're not actually proposing anything incredibly new to the intelligence community. I have this great book on my bookshelf that I haven't quite gotten to, but I've read some articles by the author that talks about this inherent weakness that terrorist groups have, which is they have to operate clandestinely, otherwise they're exposed and they can be broken up. But at the same time, they have to issue lots of internal communications, like the conferences that we coded, in order to function. This is a weakness that can be exploited, and it's been done in the past. I know that just in the past decade or so, the US Drug Enforcement Agency, supported by other arms of the US intelligence community, has done a lot of work breaking down the FARC. That's a drug-running Marxist revolutionary group in Colombia, and it's really been a tremendous success. I think here's the example of Abu Nidal. This was a terrorist group in the Middle East that was really, before Al-Qaeda, a terribly bloody group in the 70s and 80s. And US intelligence did a tremendous group. They couldn't infiltrate Abu Nidal. What they could do is convince Abu Nidal, who was a bit of a, not a bit, was a full-blown psychopath, that his own people weren't loyal. So he ended up murdering his own people and basically destroying his own group from within. These things have been done. And actually, when we were talking about it before, Mr. Bagchi mentioned that India's actually had a lot of success in its own counterinsurgency by getting groups to turn on themselves, by infiltrating the group. So this is not, we're not actually suggesting something completely new to the, there's nothing new under the sun, as they say.
Yeah, there was a question in the back which you,
how does the absence of Any action in 2009 taken to
No. Yeah, I don't remember the answer offhand. I'm sure that our data said something about it, but I'd have to go back and look at it. Do you remember 2009, absence of attacks?
Well, basically, after the Batla House encounter, there was a brief spur of activity at the end of 2008, and then they sort of tailed off. Nothing, so it fit within the coding.
So another issue which was flagged in the book is that in 2008, as you know, in November, we had a major incident in Bombay, and after that, there was a flurry of activity, both intelligence activity as well as police activity, with a great deal of success. So IM was under a lot of stress, and in fact it was on the run for some time. That explains their inability to conduct operations in 2009 in the manner in which they wanted. However, in 2010 and 11, as the book very clearly indicates, that they came back to their old ways and incidents started reporting, they took to the terrorist killings, etc. So 2009's absence is explained because of a lot of concentrated police activity all over the country following the Bombay attacks.
Yeah. But actually, I'm glad you brought up the Mumbai attacks. I did want to add one more comment on it, which is that, you know, after 2008, I think it was pretty quickly established in 2009 that the Mumbai attacks were orchestrated at fairly high levels of the ISI. There was a tremendous amount of pressure brought on Pakistan by the US, by European nations, and other countries to, you know, that this was outrageous and they needed to ramp it down. That possibly, again, our data doesn't support this, I just want to, or invalidate it for that matter. It's an open issue as far as our data is concerned. But one might hypothesize that that played a significant role as well. In addition to the police.
I think it's quite tight.
We will take more questions now.
Yes.
Madam?
Yes, I'm Dr. Das from the education sector in international education for about 30 years. In the flow charts that you initially gave us, the first one on Amazon and then IM, you had one part on behavioral model. Just for my academic interest, I would like to know whether this model is mathematical and statistical or whether you involve any other category of professionals like psychologists, sociologists in designing your model.
No, we'll take two more questions. Sorry. More questions? Yes, madam. We'll give you a chance, sir. Just now. Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Ananta. I'm a third-year student of Presidency University. So it's about a news I got a few hours back. It says that the Delhi officials have warned Arvind Kejriwal about his abduction, that the IM wants Yashid released. So what would you like to comment on that?
Okay, there. One more question.
I don't think I need a mic. My question has nothing to do with the IM actually. You have referred to your lab from time to time. How many people constitute the core group of your lab, and what is, like Sheda, what is the background, their profession? I mean, statisticians and mathematicians definitely, but what about economists, sociologists, psychologists? How many people?
They are all similar questions.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much for your questions. Our lab has, I'll start with the last question first, and this time I took the precaution of jotting down the question so I don't forget that. But our lab consists of a core group of about a dozen people, along with an affiliated group of about another 20 people. The affiliated means, you know, they show up periodically to chat with me or with Aaron and others. Related to the question you asked, the lab consists of people from computer science, public policy. Some of our models that you asked about earlier were developed in conjunction with political scientists who've been studying terrorism for 20, 30 years. And so it includes a bunch of people with a variety of backgrounds. Some of the affiliates of the lab include sociologists, Our book on La Stritaga was written jointly with a sociologist as well, and it includes a psychologist. But some of these people are affiliated with the lab, but don't show up on a daily basis. I don't want to say that. We make every effort to reach out. So we talk to people at places like West Point, who bring a military perspective to it. We talk to people, for example, in Dutch defense, who also bring a military perspective, slightly different. We've talked to Dr. Raghavan extensively on this book, which brings perspective from here. So we do have collaborators. Yeah. So where our lab doesn't have expertise, we try to fill it in with people who have the backgrounds who can complement what we have. So it really is a multidisciplinary team effort. There was a question about, so I think Kejriwal, and I think I can say a couple of things. First, there have been a couple of incidents involving IM in the past, involving kidnapping. One was the kidnapping of a businessman in Calcutta, to bring a local flavor, Partho Burman, in about early 2002, maybe 1, 2, something like that. And then there was another case of a criminal gang led by a criminal called Fazlur Rahman in Mumbai, who were engaged in not quite kidnapping, but extortion and an attempted murder. So we don't have rules we were able to derive on the basis of this because of the fact that these incidents occurred only once in each case. So there was no way to get rules with good support because something needs to happen a few times before we can say, these are the conditions under which it happens. So in respect to your question, first, most of our data covered periods of time when Mr. Kejriwal was not in the news as much as he is in the last year or so. So it's hard to hazard a guess. And second, most of our data didn't produce good rules about kidnappings, but I do want to just make the observation that there have been attempts by IM elements to carry out kidnappings in the past. They sort of are at the border of terrorist versus criminal activity, but I think that's where I'll leave it. I thought I answered.
Okay. I think we will take the last 3 questions now.
Just math people.
Are there any more questions? Yes, sir. You are 1 and 2. Okay. Will you give the microphone? 3 here. Okay. 3.
Hello, Professor. My question is on mostly ideas are technical dose now. What are the statistical techniques that you have used? To me, the 5 rules that you have shown is mostly on the data mining side. So have you used any unsupervised technique or supervised technique too? So as way of introduction, I work with PricewaterhouseCoopers, mostly on fraud analytics, AML. So I wear my technical hat, and then there's more question from that side.
Second one here.
Professor, whatever you have made the statistical modeling, it is a strategic nature. And the IB also fits information on the basis of the strategic nature. But to correlate it with it, the tactical intelligence is very important. And what Mr. Bakshi told about the NCTC, their job is to get tactical intelligence from the people. If you see, in Gujarat there is no other, up to 2002, nothing has happened because of the aggressive police tactical intelligence. And that is missing in the country. If the tactical intelligence is correlated with the strategic prediction which you have clear, then the success of these catching these people will be much easier. Because without local support, no insurgency can take place. And you see the pockets of these local supports. You can see the Hyderabad, you can see that Adhampur in UP, you can see the Kerala, that intensive area. So you require a tactical intelligence which we carry out in army in northeast, and we keep a track of the village youth who are going where he has gone, how many youths are there, we go into very much details, we keep our friendship with the people there, so that we know that each individual moving out of the village, why he has gone, where he has gone, and how he has gone. So this tactical intelligence, if it is corroborated with your strategic intelligence, I think it will be more effective. We are failure because of this.
One more question there, last. Yeah, listen.
One thing which is clear about terrorists, at least appears to me, that they operate only in certain states in India and not in others. In some states there's virtually no terrorism like Gujarat or Bengal. Virtually. So why is this?
I have a question, sir. I don't need it. Thank you. My question is, I really liked your study, what you are doing. But however, what I gathered from my understanding is your study is based on secondary data. But what you do is is directly related to everyone in the country, or rather everyone across the world. So how come people who actually do have the resource or access to the primary data is not helping you, or how come you're not asking them for the data?
Sure. Or I guess I have a mic here. Let me take the questions in the order in which they came. The first question is the technical question on what techniques are we using, unsupervised or supervised learning. Our techniques are basically supervised learning on the basis of using basically some association rule mining algorithms that we had developed. If that doesn't make sense to the rest of the audience, don't worry about it. So I'll leave it at that, but I hope it's intelligible to you. And I can give you more pointers if you wish. The question on strategic versus tactical intelligence is absolutely on the money. What we have not done, which I think you're pointing correctly to a hole in our contribution, but I do want to say that we are pretty modest in what we can solve. We can't solve everything. Is we know we have a pretty good idea on what structural strategic changes or policies need to be implemented. We don't have experience in implementing those things on the ground in a place, in anywhere in the world for that matter, whether it's India or somewhere else. So I think we are engaging in some efforts right now to look at that, or certain elements of that, but I don't think we are in a position to talk about it at this point. We don't have, not because I don't want to, but because I don't have the results. You also mentioned correctly the issue about local support feeding an insurgency, and that insurgents or terrorists cannot succeed without some local support. We've seen that in other studies we've done in both Afghanistan and Baghdad. And so you're absolutely right. I think part of the strategic recommendations we make are related, and this is the point that Mr. Bagchi also made, is, you can think of terrorism as a disease where the symptoms are the attacks, but there's some underlying cause of the disease. Stopping the attacks is like treating the symptoms, but not necessarily some of the causes. So, again, I want to go back to the point I made about human development for citizens of the country as a whole. I think human development, which is broadly targeted across religious and racial lines, will, with the right targeting and with a lot of luck, I assume, has the potential to improve the quality of lives of people. But this is not a problem that has simple solutions, and I won't pretend I have the answer to that. But I'm hoping that if people have a better quality of life and they see that there's a trajectory that is improving and that there's an effort for broad outreach, then their support for things that only bring instability and insecurity to their lives, their support for that will go down. That's the hope. I don't know if it's right.
Thank you very much. Actually, we need to come to an end to this program, But if somebody is dying to ask a question, I think.
No, I will just add 1 minute. I'll add.
No, sir. No, sorry. No, sir. No. No.
There was one more question.
Actually, there were a couple of questions that I didn't answer.
No, a very short question. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. I understand that you've been working on the Lashkar-e-Taiba, now the Indian Mujahideen. So my question is very simple. What next? And do you plan to apply the computational analysis to other security-related or political matters related to India? What next?
So, so there are a number of things we're looking at. In the studies we've discussed so far, we have looked at actions that model a group as a whole. This goes back to the question of tactics versus strategy. We have studies ongoing right now, some of which is out in the literature already, but not, it's not at a stage where I can produce a book. We're looking at the structure of terrorist networks, which would lead to things that are much more tactical. Can we look at the structure of networks and see what it is that makes them resilient and what it is that does not? So that's something we're actively looking at right now. We want to look at things like who might succeed a terrorist leader or an operative in his role if he were to be captured. Things like that. Aaron brought up the FARC earlier, and I want to give another example there. The FARC, the Colombian government at some point offered a large reward program on various terrorists. And basically this was a reward program which encouraged members of the group to turn in certain terrorist leaders of the FARC. And sure enough, what ended up happening was one of those leaders, a person called Nelly Moreno, actually turned herself in, okay, because she was sufficiently fearful of being turned in circumstances that were not of her choosing, that she tried to negotiate a deal to turn herself in. So there are a number of options like this that are tactical that we've not explored. So we're looking at structures of economic incentives and other kinds of things like that that might encourage terrorist organizations to, lose personnel. Let me give you another example. I think the one terrorist group in recent years that has almost been destroyed, not through traditional policing mechanisms, but social programs, is the FDLR. This is the Hutu group that carried out the genocides in Rwanda in the 1993-94 timeframe. The group was destabilized by President Paul Kagame of Rwanda through a DDR program, which stands for demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. He offered economic incentives and he offered options to let the people get away. Basically very light sentences for their crimes if they followed certain principles, okay? We hear a lot about problems in the DRC, but most of the FDLR operatives, except for a handful of them, have been reintegrated into Rwandan society successfully. That's an amazing accomplishment. I don't know if it can be replicated here, but I think, these are some things to look at. I do want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that we have any evidence that it would work in the case of IM.
Thank you very much. I think as the chairman, somebody chairing the session, I get the last word. Okay, we're waiting for this. I just have a few words to say. Let me begin by sharing my skepticism about the book. I think Professor Subramanian would not be surprised. I've already shared it with him. And as academics, we are always skeptical of theories and models that are put forward. And I think that's how knowledge and research advances. We are look for critics. But let me begin by my first very broad critique of computer analytics itself. Okay, I take it with a great pinch of salt. I have evaluated PhD thesis which use this, neural networks and so on and so forth. That's because I believe that any correlation that data throws up for you must first be backed up by theory. A model, that's why her question about behavioral science was extremely important. unless I have a theory which says that the presence of the precondition C gives me an outcome A or D, any kind of correlation is suspect. Okay, so if I can correlate the rainfall with the hair on my head, it does not mean the hair on my head causes the rainfall. Okay, so this is one of the problems. Secondly, and this is a question you have faced already, that the data you have got is rather scanty. That means there would be other relationships, and that's why you are getting sometimes, in each of the models is getting a probability of success of 100%, and also the inverse probability 100%. Now, this cannot be a behavioral model which tells me that my model will predict it with 100% accuracy. I do not think any behavior can be predicted in that way. Okay, and that when I shared with him, he said yes, because he just 4 data points or 5 data points. There were 5 conferences held, and there were 10 attacks or something, and within certain months, and we correlate, we would get 100% correlation. But maybe there were other conferences about which we don't have data. That means I am in Mujahideen met in secret, on which the sources he has used have not been able to report or did not know about it. So these are the major gaps in it. Let me talk about a few strengths of the book. I really enjoyed reading it. Okay, and let me point out certain big differences. I have not seen this book in LLC. First thing is, unlike Laxmi Toiba, this seems to be entirely homegrown and driven by homegrown factors. It is driven by communal riots in India, it is driven by arrest of people from, it is driven by grievances of local minority communities who feel they have been shortchanged, who feel that the legal system in the country has not been able to give them the justice that they sought. And he quotes certain, he tells us how Simi split up at a certain point of time after the demolition of Babri Masjid. In his model, he also tells us that as activists in civil society, Mr. Kapoor and myself are very active in the Pakistan-India People's Group for Peace, that establishing peace, establishing good communal relations is vital to undermine the social base of these kinds of things. He listed those 5 things for you to do, and those are very right. It means, as citizens, you and I have the task of this thing. Firstly, I believe the Pakistan-India's relation should not be affected by little terrorist attacks. Absolutely. Especially when we know IAM attacks are indigenously triggered and have local roots only. Secondly, I'm really amazed that though the book claims that they have some support from Pakistani sources and so on and so forth, that the crude technology and bombs used continuously. As a matter of fact, the earlier attacks on the American mission, American center in Calcutta, used sophisticated arms where they really fired and killed policemen. Every other subsequent attack seems to have gone back. These are crudely made bombs which explode. Sometimes they kill large number of people, sometimes they don't kill anybody. Okay. So how come that if they were in contact with international terrorist groups, the technology could not be sophisticated, there were no arms coming in, and so on and so forth. And so I would, to me this would mean I suspect the degree of correlation, the support that they receive from international groups. I would doubt it.
Despite the name being international Mujahideen?
Pardon?
Despite the name being
Indian Mujahideen. Indian Mujahideen. Please note the name. Okay. And lastly, I think that despite its shortcomings, the book really tells us
Thank you so much.
With our compliments. Mr. Bakshi, please.
Very well modeled.
Thank you very much.
Very exciting.
Leadership especially. And thank you all for coming here. And as Professor Khanna has very succinctly concluded the session, I think even at one time meteorology was considered a very difficult predictive science. So hopefully this will also improve over the years. Thank you very much.